Hello, welcome to another edition of At Home with the Roosevelts. Today we're doing an author talk with Judith Sumner, who's written a fascinating book about plants go to war. And it really is part of a bigger story that she's been studying or talking about for most of her life, which is how integrated plants are into our everyday life. So Judith, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what gave you the inspiration to write this book?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I would say it was a few different factors that all came together and spoke to me, said, this is a topic that no one has explored, and wouldn't it be interesting to try to get a sort of a compendium, a little encyclopedic treatment of how plants were actually used in many ways during World War II. So certainly one factor was stories I heard from my own father. My father was a chemist during World War II with the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company. I think many of my generation grew up hearing combat stories. I grew up hearing chemistry stories because the 43rd Chemistry Company dealt with a number of different plant products. They dealt with latex and quinine and various other plant products, and that's the work he did during the war. And so it certainly got me thinking about plant uses during war. And then also, Richard Evans Schultes, who's long been regarded as the father of modern ethnobotany, always said during his lifetime that we should really let botanists write some of the history, because botanists will come at it with some of the basic scientific information to understand plants and how they were used in wartime. And so often war involves food and medicines that I think botanists like me can add a little bit of illumination in that regard. And then lastly, there was a wonderful review article written by Richard Howard, who for many years had been the director of the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard. And Richard's article was a review of the jobs that botanists had held during the war in the Pacific Theater. And that got me thinking, well, if that's what botanists did, what did the plants do? And how about a worldwide view of the role of plants during World War II? So I started collecting material for this quite a while ago. I had a sophisticated file system consisting of a cardboard box and an electronic file. Whenever I found something, I would dump it either physically or electronically into the file. And then finally, about 5 or 6 years ago, I had time to sit down and write the book. And so that's the story of it.
Well, interesting. I have, speaking of fathers, we have some connections in that regard. You have spoken and worked at the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard. My father, during the war, was a postdoc at Harvard. Worked at the Arnold Arboretum. He was a botanist and a cytologist. And so I grew up hearing stories about plants. And he actually did one of his first big projects was working with the Army to find ways to ship potatoes across the Atlantic in ships by irradiating them to see if they could stabilize them that way. So yes, Arnold. And my father's name was Arnold Sparrow, so we've got lots of connections there. But Franklin Roosevelt had a lifelong interest in plants, specifically in trees. He often described himself as a tree farmer. The property up here in Hyde Park, the 1,000 and 1,200 acres that they owned, was really a tree farm. He grew all kinds of trees, including Christmas trees. He once sent a Christmas tree to Winston Churchill during the war. But he really understood the role of trees and plants in the ecosystem. And of course, it was one of his big innovations was using growing and planting and irrigation to stop the erosion of the Dust Bowl. So talk a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt and how he approached the plant world.
Well, Roosevelt was an outdoorsman, and he had the foresight to start the Civilian Conservation Corps in the years prior to the war. Of course, much of the U.S. had been deforested during World War I, 1917 to 1918. There was a mass panicked deforestation to harvest wood for airplanes, and that included many virgin timber stands in the U.S. They were vastly depleted during World War I. And so looking down the road, I think that President Roosevelt predicted war in Europe and the need for wood. And so the Civilian Conservation Corps, 3 million young men planted 3 billion trees and reforested much of the U.S. And some authors have even, some historians have even speculated that this was a way of preparing young men for the rigors of war in the outside, because many of these guys came from cities and they were really not used to working physically outside. And so they were really soldiers in waiting, getting some physical training and sort of building up their bodies and eating 3 square meals a day. And of course, much of the vision that Roosevelt had came from his honeymoon. When he and Eleanor were in Europe, he visited the forests in the Black Forest, which were man-made forests. They were planted, and he saw how wonderfully the Europeans cared for forests. He saw how remarkably the forests were trimmed and replanted and harvested systematically, and diseases were obliterated. Tree strains were selected for planting. And he said, why aren't we doing that in the U.S.? The tendency in the U.S. at the time was to treat forests as if they were a renewable natural resource that just somehow magically reseeded and replanted. And so I think Roosevelt had tremendous foresight, realizing that woodlands and forests are something that we all need and that we really have to plant almost like an agricultural crop. And that's what he did with the CCC. So it was much of that wood that was planted by the CCC was actually ready to harvest by World War II, and was used then in the vast number of things we needed wood for. One airplane hangar alone was 1,000 feet long and 16 stories high, and those were made completely from millions of board feet of wood. And so, and then to say nothing of barracks and Quonset huts. And of course, in Europe, even the airplanes were made of wood. We did not have wood airplanes in this country, but still, it was a tremendous foresight seeing what was coming down the road.
Well, and Franklin Roosevelt wasn't the only person who was preparing for war. To talk about how American households prepared for war as it was approaching, and the roles that the home gardens and things like that played in America's response.
Well, we'll switch over and talk a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt. Even before the United States was involved in World War II as a player, she saw war in Europe, and she knew that we were participating in the Lend-Lease program, and she realized what was coming, and she was encouraging Claude Wickard, who was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, to let's plant a victory garden on the lawn of the White House. And Wickard was opposed to this. American agriculture had just had some great years, and he really wanted to encourage people to purchase commercial agricultural foods and not start Americans down the pathway of home gardening. But once Pearl Harbor occurred, Wickard agreed that we really have to encourage people with home gardens, and so they did in fact plant a victory garden on the grounds of the White House. And of course, this wasn't the first such garden. There was a war garden planted there during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and that had been planted over. So now we had, during World War II, a victory garden at the White House, and at the same time, victory gardens being encouraged at American homes. And anyone who had any kind of a backyard or a plot of land was encouraged to plant. Originally, the idea was the garden should be at least 30 feet wide and 50 feet long. Many Americans didn't have that amount of space. Turns out that actually some of the most productive gardens were urban gardens that were planted just on small plots of land and cultivated intensively. But all of a sudden, American women were doing a lot of gardening that they hadn't predicted that they would be doing before. They found themselves not only gardening, but doing it with whatever tools they could find. Tools were in short supply because all of a sudden metal was in high demand. So sometimes you had to borrow tools. Even seeds were in short supply because the United States was getting many of its garden seeds from Holland. And once Holland was occupied by the Germans, we were not getting imported garden seeds. And so people were told, in the past, maybe you would have dropped 3 or 4 seeds in the hole in the ground. Now you better just put 1 in there and hope that it comes up. And when it does come up, take care of it really well. At the same time, there was a big shift in eating in this country because rationing was imposed. And the first foods that were rationed included some botanical foods like coffee and sugar. But then there were also foods like canned peaches and canned peas that were virtually impossible to get. And even, I should say, despite rationing, supply was often a problem. And so foods sort of had de facto rationing if you couldn't get your hands on them. And so having your own food resource in your backyard was a great thing. At the same time, there was also a shift, and American housewives found themselves barraged with a big movement nutritionally toward vegetable-based meals that were augmented by meat rather than meat-based meals with a couple of side dishes of vegetables. And so a pound of meat, which before might have fed a family of four, now might feed a family of 6 or 8 or a family of 4 for 2 meals. And so having a source of vegetables with which to round out your meals and make all of these soups and stews that contain small amounts of meat for flavor was a big shift. American women also found themselves barraged with literature about nutrition because vitamins were a relatively new discovery. There were 14 Nobel Prizes for vitamins between 1928 and 1943. And these were Nobel Prizes for the discovery, the elucidation, the chemistry, the physiology of vitamins. So these were new, and they were considered extremely important as nutritional elements to winning the war. Foods were recategorized into 3 categories: bodybuilding foods, energy foods, and protective foods. And protective foods contained virtually all of the high vitamin leafy greens and yellow and orange vegetables, and many of which people could grow. The gardens, the Victory Gardens, resembled in many ways the vegetable gardens that were grown in this country during the 17th and 18th centuries. It was really a revisiting American gardening history. The big difference is that until probably about 1860, most Americans were very suspicious of tomatoes. Tomatoes were widely believed to be poisonous in the 19th century. And finally, they were accepted after trial and error, and people learned to cook them and realized they weren't going to die if they ate one. Whereas during World War II, tomatoes were really the mainstay of many Victory Gardens. And if you couldn't grow anything else, if you grew tomatoes, that was a good thing. They could be the basis of many, many main dishes, of soups and stews. And most importantly, they were a critical source of vitamin C. Paul, would it be horrible of me to mention another book that I wrote that covers quite a bit of this colonial business?
No.
American Household Botany. This came out, I think, in 2005, and the paperback came out in about 2012. And that really, that was a fun book for me to write. And because I sort of have a 19th century mindset, and that really delves into the foods and the drugs, the medicines, the herbs, the timber, virtually everything I could discover about home life in America from 1620 to 1900.
Now, the National Park Service, with the home here in Hyde Park, next to the library and museum, they have instituted a new home garden. And they have tried to show how the Roosevelts might have grown some of their own produce. It's now part, because the grounds are open to the public even while our buildings are closed because of the pandemic. It really does show that they were working very hard throughout the entire time that Franklin Roosevelt was growing up to grow a substantial portion of their own food. But of course, during World War II, plants weren't just used for nutrition, they were also used for medicinal reasons. And there were a lot of plants that became very important for medical reasons. You want to talk about some of the medicinal plants and herbs that were used?
Well, again, if we look to sort of wartime planning, the U.S. got in some trouble with quinine because we did not have independent sources of quinine outside of Java. And fighting the war in the Pacific, we needed quinine to quell malaria. And so we had shortages of quinine. We really did not have good substitutes for quinine. That is something that was finally solved synthetically by the end of the war. In Europe, in England specifically, they had been getting all of their pharmaceutical drugs from Holland. And again, when just like us with the garden seeds, they found themselves not only needing garden seeds, but they also needed pharmaceutical drugs from Holland. And so they turned to collecting herbal medicines or herbal plants as ingredients for pharmaceutical medicines. We began to get worried about that in this country. And actually at the Arnold Arboretum, where your dad was the postdoc and where I've done a lot of teaching, the botanists there decided what we really need to do in case we end up in a similar case of not having enough familiar, well-known medicinal plants. We need to go back, look in history at plants that we know are medicinal, and start growing them here to see which ones really will thrive well that we could grow at a commercial agricultural scale. So they worked with the pharmacists, the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy in Boston, and they planted a tremendous multi-acre medicinal herb garden at the Arnold Arboretum, which looked like a large-scale colonial herb garden. Basically had in it all of the known medicinal plants that colonial housewives were growing in their dooryard gardens to treat their families. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that people were practicing herbal medicine in the strict sense. Not many Americans were going out and collecting herbs and doctoring themselves. They were, relying on pharmaceutical drugs. These were being grown as possible substitutes for pharmaceutically known plants that might be in short supply. So, for instance, a well-known set of plants would be members of the tomato family, the nightshades. And henbane was used, and deadly nightshade was used. Well, these are European plants. If those became difficult to obtain, or they were difficult to grow for some reason, there's an American plant called jimsonweed that contains the same compounds. It also is a nightshade. It's a member of the tomato family, and so that's what they were doing at Harvard. They were growing the known plants, and they were growing plants that might be possible substitutes. And we didn't get to that point, but it was good to know. It was good data to have that even in an urban setting like the Arnold Arboretum, what could you grow, and what could American farmers grow if necessary on a large scale? Certainly, one plant that was grown on a large scale in this country were opium poppies, because we were tremendously dependent upon morphine. I think if someone were to say to me, so what is the single most important plant in war, or the single most important drug plant, I would have to say morphine, or opium, which contains morphine. It comes from the opium poppy. The opium poppy is also known as the breadseed poppy. If you've ever eaten a bagel with poppy seeds on it, that is the breadseed poppy. And some strains produce a lot of this opium-containing latex. Here in this country, it was being packaged in little syrettes with controlled doses by the Squid Company. And you don't want to be in combat unless there's a supply of morphine nearby, is what it boils down to. And so opium poppies were being grown in large quantities. In Europe, people were being asked to grow them in their own gardens and then to donate them to the government.
Nazi Germany also was very deeply involved in production of opium and cocaine, coca plants, and methamphetamine and other stimulants. The Nazis used them in massive quantities.
They did.
Because they controlled most of Europe, they took over the Dutch pharmaceutical industry, and because for a long time they controlled large portions of Africa, they had a real control over the flow of those drugs.
They did. That is exactly right. Yes. Everyone needed opium, and there was one particular drug, or I should say a mixture of drugs that the Germans were using, known as Scofidol, SEE. And it was administered to soldiers who had been severely injured in combat. And it contained an opiate. It contained scopolamine, which is one of the compounds, the alkaloids from the nightshades. And scopolamine in small doses prevents motion sickness, and in larger doses will wipe out long-term memory. And then the third component to SEE, Scofidol, was ephedrine, and ephedrine also is an alkaloid that will constrict blood vessels. So that combination of the opiate, the scopolamine, and the ephedrine would eliminate pain, eliminate long-term memories of the terrors of war, and also constrict blood vessels and try to control bleeding in the event of a severe wound. And that was administered to young men who had been severely injured in war. And it's, by the way, chemically very similar to the mixture that was used in twilight sleep in Germany. Twilight sleep was a method of childbirth. It was a method of drugged childbirth that became very popular after World War I, when the population of Germany had decreased and they were at a standstill and they wanted to see more childbirths. And then Hitler really promoted it because it was a way to have more births and more soldiers being born. And it was a mixture. The mixture that was used in twilight sleep was a combination of an opiate and scopolamine, no ephedrine. And women were dosed with this, And it was used even in this country. It was used up and through them into the 1960s. It was initially seen as something that was quite upscale, and it was the upper tiers of society, socioeconomically speaking, who got it. They thought it was a good way to have to birth a child. And then by the end, it was women in impoverished inner city hospitals who were the last to get it. And the reason that it was stopped was that I'm not sure it was even terribly effective. I had a neighbor at one point who had given birth to 4 of her 5 children using twilight sleep. And she told me that actually the hallucinations were terrifying and you still felt the pain. So you had 2 things to deal with, not just one. And some women overreacted to the scopolamine, hallucinated, and had to be restrained and have their hands covered, or they crept out on fire escapes thinking that they might be able to fly. So it was really very, very dangerous. But I thought it was interesting that it's basically the same combination of botanical medicines for young men in combat who might be injured, and then the mothers who actually gave birth to them, who went through the pain and the potential terrors of childbirth.
Well, now, in addition to the obvious benefits of the medicines that were created from these plants, probably the single most important component out of the plant world was wood. And although we tend to use wood as a singular, like everything's the same, in fact, different kinds of wood are radically different and were used for many different things. You know, the kind of wood you might use on the deck of a ship is very different than the kind of wood you might use in the wings of an airplane. So talk a little bit about how the science of carpentry and wood evolved during this period and why it was so important to understand the different qualities that different trees had and how you were going to use that final product.
Well, of course, the U.S. going into the war knew quite a bit about plant anatomy. We certainly had botanists, and botanists had sliced wood and looked at sections of it and knew quite a bit about parameters like specific gravity, which is a reflection of density, and microscopically what kinds of crystals and cell structure you might find in wood. But once we got involved in the Pacific region, that was a whole new botanical world, and many of those plants had not been studied. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, to some extent, started off down there with a trial and error technique. And if you put up telegraph poles leading to Leh in Solomon Islands, and lo and behold, within a few weeks, they have decomposed because of insect attack or fungal attack, you have just determined that whatever wood you used was the wrong wood. And so the U.S. Navy became deeply interested, as did the Army Corps of Engineers, in what kinds of woods could be used for underwater piers or telephone poles or shelters or Quonset huts or anything else that had to be built in the Pacific region. Where did they get the information? Well, some was just trial and error, but quite a bit of it also came from talking to local people and communicating with them in Pidgin English or local languages as much as communication was allowed, and finding out, well, what do you build with? What do you use if you need to construct something underwater? What do you use to make a canoe, which might be a hint of a wood that's not going to decompose quickly in water? And then, of course, the field of botany. And I think any botanist learning about this, I think we feel a little bit vindicated because sometimes botanists, like myself, study truly obscure topics to the extent that we have been asked, why exactly are you studying that? Is this somehow important? And the answer is, well, you never know when you might need some information about wood or anything else for that matter. And so suddenly there was a considerable amount of fairly esoteric scientific data that during World War II became extremely useful, if not to people devising new medicines and to people devising uses for woods. And so some of this actually came from herbarium sheets. Botanists like me like to make herbarium sheets. And this is a pressed specimen, typically of the foliage and the reproductive parts, the flowers and the fruit of the plant. And then we often will add whatever anecdotal notes we've been able to collect. And so if you're working in the South Pacific, perhaps you talk to a local person or a guide and asked, well, what do you do with this plant? Do you eat it, or do you build with it, or are the fibers useful, or is it medicinal? And these notes will be added it to the herbarium sheet, typed out and added to the sheet. And so in some cases, it was just a matter of going to a cabinet at one of these collections of dried plants, which we call herbaria, taking out the herbarium sheets and reading the notes for the Solomon Islands or Fiji or wherever, there was an interest in learning about the local plants. And so it was sort of this combination of trial and error, known botanical knowledge, and then going and harvesting facts that perhaps had been stored for 100 years in a herbarium case somewhere.
So last question, and this is a fun one because it goes to a plant that literally touched almost every soldier in the war, which is cotton. And the cotton plant really played an incredibly vital role in World War II.
Certainly in terms of agricultural crops, I think cotton was the most important crop we had in this country. It might not be something most of us think of too often, but cotton was in every uniform. It was in every bit of tentage, every bit of canvas had cotton in it, and we just used a huge amount of it. And also, of course, every bandage was cotton as well. And so its importance cannot be underestimated. It was also one of the first hybrid crops that we grew in this country. Something I didn't mention earlier was that all of the vegetable plants that were grown in victory gardens during the war were essentially very similar to the varieties that were grown in colonial and post-colonial America. They were open pollinated heirloom varieties in the sense that none of them were hybrids. They could just save the seed and replant. You get the same plant coming up the next year. But the need for cotton drove the need for hybridization. And so cotton production was vastly increased by intentionally breeding traits into cotton plants through hybridization. Now, much of the cultivation of cotton was actually done by Germans living in the U.S. And you might wonder, well, how did that happen? Well, these were prisoners of war who had been captured abroad and brought to the U.S. to sit out the war. Most of them were foot soldiers. They were glad to be here. It was not a bad respite point for them. They certainly were avoiding combat. They were being well fed, well cared for. And so in states like Oklahoma, they did a lot of the cotton farming. They worked alongside the families who had the cotton farms. Some of them even sat at the meal tables with the families and ate. Several of them then emigrated to the U.S. after the war and became Americans. And yes, cotton was extremely important. Absolutely.
Well, now this conversation today is actually something that we're doing in partnership with the Poughkeepsie Public Library for this year's Big Read program. And the Poughkeepsie Public Library have been great partners with us over the years. We do a lot of work with them. But to end, I just want to ask you the question that's a little bit off topic for World War II, which is, what's your favorite flower?
My favorite flower? Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Oh, gee. That's a tough one. I like almost every flower.
Well, I'll give you a second to think. Well, my personal favorite flower is the bearded iris, which I think is one of the most beautiful plants. And of course, my mother grew iris when I was growing up, so that probably had something to do with it. But come on, you must have a favorite flower.
Okay, I'll name a favorite flower. I like Aquilegia. I like columbines very much.
I love columbines.
Yeah, I live in Massachusetts. We have the red columbines, Aquilegia canadensis. But if you go out west, there are many different ones. And what I find sort of interesting about them is that they have these long nectar spurs. And the length of those nectar spurs that can vary between maybe a centimeter and 3 centimeters in length correlate directly with the length of the beaks of the hummingbirds that pollinate them. So the little hummingbirds with the short bills pollinate the short spurred ones, and then it's just a beautiful little evolutionary story. But I also think they're really beautiful flowers. And then if you open up something like the Burpees catalog, you can find the hybridized ones, like the McCanna's hybridized ones, where you throw out one seed packet and you get every seed germinates into something different, all different kinds of crazy color combinations. And I think that's sort of fun too.
Well, up here in the Hudson Valley and up in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, in the spring, when you walk through the woods and you come across a wild columbine, it's just the most beautiful thing anywhere. Judith, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It's a fascinating subject and something that, it sort of taken for granted the role that these plants played in our life, and particularly during World War II. And thank you for this great book.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode of At Home with the Roosevelts. Hope to see you soon.